to the History Slam podcast from ActiveHistory.ca. Here's your host, Sean Graham.
Thank you, Adam. Welcome to the History Slam, everybody. I am Sean Graham, coming at you today nearly live from Ottawa, Ontario, where we have a really interesting show today. There is a new article that's just been published in the Canadian Journal of History entitled Conscripting Canada's Past, the Harper Government and the Politics of Memory. And with us today, we have the author of that article from the Université de Saint-Boniface, Yves Frenette. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Sean. Hi.
I'm really happy that you're here, and we should just point out, if it's not obvious from the sound, we're not actually together right now. You're in Quebec at your summer house doing some writing, and I'm here in Ottawa. So if there's a slight delay in the audio, that's the reason for that. Now, before we really delve into the issues surrounding the article, Conscripting Canada's Past, could you just give us maybe a bit of a summary? What's the article about?
The article is really about the government, the Harper government, and its use, and some would say abuse of the Canadian past. It's I don't think that you will find anything very new in the article, but what the article does is to put together most of the actions of the Harper government since 2006 about memory and Canadian history. The War of 1812, the cuts to the archives, the cuts to Parks Canada. There is also I also mentioned briefly the abolition of the long form of the census and the rewriting of Canadian history to highlight the monarchy and Canadians' military past, the transformation of the Museum of Civilization into the Canadian Museum of History. And at the beginning, I tried to put that in the context of the advent of conservatism in Canada and of the Conservative Party.
So they're putting together a narrative through their commemoration that fits their version of Canada?
I think so, yes. It's part of it. We have a government it's interesting because we have the most activist government that we have had, at least in recent memory, on the memory front, on the heritage front. But it is so because the government wants to, if you want to reinvent the Canadian past in order to create the Canada that it wants to create. So there is a continuity there, and it's not something which is peculiar to Canada. Lately, I mean, first of all governments, all politicians, I think, use history. It's part of it. The Harper government is not the only government to do it. But recently, what we have seen in the Western world among conservative government and right-wing governments like the Sarkozy government in France is an attempt to rewrite history and basically the same conflict that we have had here in Canada between, let's say, social historians and historians who want to, academics and non-academics who want to show, to highlight the unity of the country, the social unity, the political unity. We have seen that also in the States. We have also seen that in France, to take only those two countries.
You mentioned that all governments sort of do this to a certain extent. What makes what this government is doing unique in that context?
I think that's what makes this government unique is the scope of their interventions in the field, and I would say it's the brutality with the way that they do it. And although they have academic allies, they have very few academic allies, and there are few intellectuals behind that. They are a couple, but basically it's a government which is anti-intellectual. And what is interesting also with the government, on the one hand, the Harper government tells us we love history. We all lovers of Canadian history. But at the same time, they cut into there are major cuts to the great institutions that promote history in this country, especially the National Archives.
So those two things don't really jive together, these cuts and then arguing that they like history. So in determining then which events that they're going to commemorate, which ones they're going to try to construct social memory around, how do you think that they've been making their decisions? What has been guiding their process in determining which events should be commemorated?
I think that what is at the basis of their process is their emphasis on the monarchy and their emphasis on military history. And I think that there are two reasons which interplay that explain that. They want, and I'm not the first to say that, I'm not the last to say that, the conservatives, Stephen Harper's conservatives, would like to go back to a Canada pre-1960s, where a Canada which is idealized as a Canada where there were not as many divisions, and where there was more unity, at least on the English Canadian side. So it's they reimagine the past. At the same time, and I think they truly believe that this is the way the past should be portrayed. But at the same time, it's very hard for them to undo 40 years of almost half a century of liberal rule in this country. Because since the Liberals governed Canada basically with some interruptions since the Second World War, pretty much everything that is today's Canada has been a legacy of the Liberals. And the Conservatives have, I think, to work very hard to show that they are as Canadians as the Liberals. And in order to do that, they have to create a different narrative of what Canada is about. In fact, they are quite one of the books that one of the historians they get inspiration from is C.P. Champion, who clearly states in his book on the demise of British Canada, a book that came out in 2010, if I'm not mistaken, that for Champion and for the Conservatives, the liberal, especially the Pearson government and its academic allies in the 1960s, especially between 64 and 68, they break from the true Canada by creating new symbols, the flag, for instance. And in doing so, in fact, it's interesting because Champion calls Pearson and his academic allies neo-nationalists. For them, a true nationalist is at the same time someone who assumes fully his Britishness and the legacy of Britain and of the British Empire.
Now, what would you say, though, to someone who would argue that if the last 40 years, 50 years have been a liberal version of history and commemoration, that putting forth a more conservative version of history is simply balancing what has been done previously?
I think it's a fair enough question. It's a fair enough comment. What I would answer to this argument is that while the liberals did that, they were not as interventionists in terms of recreating the Canadian past, and they were not as involved themselves as politicians. And I don't think that in order to create the country that they wanted to create, the liberals had felt the need as much, I'm not sure why, felt the need as much to recreate, to reinvent the Canadian past. this is something that the conservatives are doing, and I cannot think of an event that the liberals wanted to commemorate that would be as oversimplifying as the War of 1812. If you look at if you go to the site of Heritage Canada and you look at what the Prime Minister is saying about the War of 1812, not only it is an oversimplification, but it's an interpretation that doesn't hold, that is completely unrealistic.
That's one of the things that I found really interesting too, is that the War Museum did their 1812 temporary exhibit, and I thought it was really well done because it had the four different perspectives of the war, and it delved into the complexity of it and how nuanced the whole conflict was. And then you had these commercials on TV for the War of 1812 that had this very defined narrative of Canada wins. And it was striking how different those two things were, and how well done and how nuanced one of them was, and how sort of direct the other one was.
Exactly, and I think that we have to be careful not to get into conspiracy theories because of the complexities of the Canadian political system, of the Canadian civil service, the fact that the museums have lots of autonomy. This is the same thing with the transformation of the Canadian Museum of Civilization into the Canadian Museum of History. And I was one who was very worried. I was at the announcement in October 2012 of this new museum, and it was when we listened to Minister Moore, James Moore, who was then Minister of Heritage, it was clear that for the government, the museum its principal role would be to celebrate Canadian history and not to promote the understanding of Canadian history. And in fact, the law creating the new museum, there is not much change from the law that had created the Canadian Museum of Civilization, except for the term critical understanding, which was in the mandate of the Canadian Museum of Civilization, and which is not in the new Canadian Museum of History. But having said that, the new Canadian Museum of History, the managers, the gestionnaire of the Canadian Museum of History, I think they are very aware that, you don't make an exhibition to please your political masters. So they have created a committee. I'm on one of those committees with about 30 historians, most of them academic historians, others who are not academic historians. And, this is challenging to try to show to create an exhibit that will show, as you mentioned, for the 1812, the different perspectives, the complexity of historical processes. But at least, I don't know what will be the result, but at least the Canadian Museum of History is trying to do that. So they are checks and balances within our political system that can slow down the government on what it wants to do. In terms of commemoration, there is not that much. There is no check and balance, because this is, the government arm that is responsible for commemoration is the Department of Heritage, and this is a department of the government that changes direction when there is a new government or sometimes a new minister.
That aspect of it I find really interesting too, because I've read some stuff where the government seems to have expressed some level of disappointment with the War of 1812 project, that they didn't get the response that they were hoping for, and that's just a piece or two that I've read, and I don't know the validity of those and from where they're coming and exactly what the impact was and what the engagement with the public was of these projects. But it leads me to a question that is it not still kind of up to the public as to what we commemorate? Sure, the government can put on ads and say, we're going to do this, we're going to do this, but the meaning of these events, especially in a public sense, it still comes from the people who are going to engage with it, does it not?
I think so. I think that I think there's part of that. I mean, there are very few, of course. Of course, the impact of public policy on national reconstruction or on our collective representations of the past, it's not something that you can assess in a short term, you know. Right. In 25 years, probably, maybe in 50 years, we will be able to see, you know, what will have been the impact of those years of conservative rule. But what I have seen goes in the same direction as you know, the Canadian, the indications, let's be very careful here, the indications that the Canadian public doesn't care much about the War of 1812, and they care more about if there had been a commemoration of the Charter of 1982, of the women's getting the vote in 1919. But I think that in the case of the War of 1812, I think it was bad judgment on the part of the government or of their advisors. I think that it would have been they would have had far more success than they may have with the First World War, for instance, where a great part of the Canadian population still feel close to the First World War, and where the impact of the war has been greater. Of course, it will be interesting to see how they will market the commemoration of the war of how they market the commemoration of the war of the First World War, because, you know, I mean, 30% of the population, French Canadians, a majority of them were against or very lukewarm towards the conflict, the engagement of Canadians in the conflict.
And actually, yeah, that First World War stuff is really interesting because, you know, it is 2014. We're on the cusp of the 100th anniversary of the outbreak of the war. And it's something that I think is going to be really interesting and is part of the concern that I think a lot of people have, a lot of historians have, with the government's commemorations effort, have to do with now, with the First World War coming up, that this narrative of Canada being born during the First World War, being born on Vimy Ridge, is that narrative going to sort of take hold now in the official commemorations of the war, and that really could be a distorting of Canadian history in a way that takes more meaning or has more effect than anything that's happened so far.
I think you're right about that. I think that at the same time, I think it will be it's more difficult for the government it may be more dangerous, in fact, because what happened with the War of 1812 is that, I mean, the narrative that they that they promoted was so, and is so anachronistic that Canada became united in 1812, and that everybody fought for the Queen or for Canada. Well, Canada didn't exist, so yeah. I don't need to talk much about that, but because I think that most of our audience knows that. And you're right that for the First World War, it's probably not as difficult to promote that Canada was born with the First World War. I have nothing against commemoration. I think I'm not one of those historians who oppose memory and history. I think it's very important to have commemorations, because commemorations can also be moments where we can understand and use commemoration to understand events. I will myself participate in the fall in a Canada-France colloquium on the First World War, talking about the impact of the war on North American Francophone societies in Canada and the United States. So they could be great moments of understanding and at the same time and honoring people from the past or events from the past. But if the balance is too much on uncritical commemoration, this is where there is a problem. At the same time, probably that the conservatives will say, on one hand, we have historians like Frenette who think that we commemorate too much or we don't commemorate well, and on the other hand, we have prominent historians who think that we're not commemorating enough. So that's probably one of the answers that they will give us. What is interesting too, and I think it's important, we have to think about the electoral context too. 2014 is not very far from 2015. So since last summer, it seems to me that the government has slowed down its attack would be too strong a term, but it's rewriting of Canadian history. It may have to do with the change of ministers in the Ministry of Heritage. Mm-hmm. It may have to do with the fact that the government is busy, the Harper government is busy on many fronts. There are many crises, and simply that they have to be more careful in 2014 than they were in 2012 because an election is looming.
Yeah, that's true. And that's something that I actually hadn't thought about. That it's a different context now. Is that if they put together a campaign that people universally reject, they're going to face an election next year.
Yeah, they have to face an election. They have at least temporarily alienated, a constituency, the veterans that were allies of them. I have to say, on the other hand, that very recently they made since the beginning of the year, they made two excellent appointments. They named Mark Christmanson, who is a historian, as head of the National Capital Commission, and they also appointed just very recently the new archivist of Canada, Guy Bertillon, who was the National Archivist of Quebec, and who is a very, very good administrator. And I don't know what he will be able to do because the situation is so bad at the archives. But at least I think now they are showing that they have to be very careful who they are appointing, because I think they realize that on the one hand to promote the love of Canadian history and to let institutions decline like the archives, that there is a fundamental contradiction there. The big question, of course, is, are they going to be reelected? And I think that if they're going to be reelected and if they have another majority government, then I think we're in for even more reinvention of the Canadian past.
And I think, too, part of that is it seems as though they've done a pretty good job with the consultations on the Museum of History, the new Museum of History. And you said that you've been part of one of those committees. And
they did, but I would say that it's not them. It's the museum.
Right.
And I mean, I don't want to take any credit from the president and the vice presidents of the Museum of History. At the same time, there has been quite a lobby from the historical establishment, especially from the Canadian Historical Association, to make sure that, there will be consultation.
Now, you mentioned something earlier, and this is something that's come up not just in history, but in other areas, that the government has been disregarding experts. This came up, there was this rally about science, and there's a lot of people in the science community who are concerned with what the government's doing. But if we put this into the history context, and this is something that somebody mentioned to me last year at the CHA, and I won't say who it is, this person theorized that one of the reasons that the government has been disregarding historians, at least, is that historians haven't engaged with the public well enough, and that they look at historians and say, well, you are all off doing your own things. You're not engaging with people. You're not producing material that people care about. So why should we involve you in these discussions? And that was the theory that was presented. And I don't know how I feel about that. That seems a little far to the extreme, but how do you feel about this concept that historians aren't active enough in engaging the public and getting the public to understand the issues surrounding commemorations and the construction of memory?
Well, I don't know. I think that it's partly true, but at the same time, I don't think that our colleagues in political science or sociology are very much consulted by the government. I think that even their own scientists, they don't consult much. So this is true that we need to have, that historians, we have to be more engaged. And I don't believe myself in this conflict between, on the one hand, this opposition between between national history and social history. I mean, there is political history, there is social history, and I think that it's possible to be a good social historian and to appeal to a wide audience.
Yeah, I truly believe that as well. That I think every form of history has an audience.
But the problem is that Parks Canada, we have not talked about Parks Canada, was doing a wonderful job of attracting Canadians and especially new Canadians to its sites. And now, some sites have closed. There will be no interpretation this summer. In Quebec City, the entire archaeological section is gone. There is no archaeologist anymore. There is just one in Quebec City. So those institutions, and I remind you that those institutions the people who work there they don't work in academia, but they are patented historians. They are historians who have studied history, who have BAs, MAs, PhDs, and they work in this field, and they are so competent. But now it is Parks Canada is declining. So one more time, we see experts who are shoved aside.
And is that really the danger then of this whole thing? For as much as the government might try to put together a defined narrative of what history is, but again, people can choose to consume that or not. But is the real danger then not the effects that these policies will have on things like Parks Canada or other historical institutions and things that do engage with the public and do engage in a way that is a little more nuanced and really tries to discuss the issues surrounding history rather than promote a singular narrative. And it strikes me that might be the biggest danger behind what's going on.
I think so. At the end of my piece, I talk about the damage that the Harper government has done. It is not so much in terms of commemoration, because I think it's possible to counterbalance that with other narratives, although they will not be official narratives. And I think it's possible to show the complexity of events that are commemorated and their impact and et cetera. But you're right that the big impact, negative impact, is on the institutions that promote the knowledge and the understanding of history, Parks Canada and the National Archives. And in the National Archives, there has been a deprofessionalization. Here, the government would probably say, well, I mean, we don't make those decisions, but they are the ones who appoint the National Archivist. And in 2009, they appointed an archivist who is not a historian, who is not a professional archivist. And then what we had librarians who become archivists and archivists who become librarians, and even more so, specialists in information management. And who make decisions and who don't know really what they are doing. So I hope the new archivist will be able to steer the ship back where it should go. But and here it's not only the conservative. Mind you, it had started in 1990. I mean, the number that I have seen is that the budget of the National Archives since 1990 has been reduced by 58%. This is a lot in 23 years.
Yeah.
So, you know, I mean, it will be very difficult to do. On the other hand, I'm going to take the example of the National Archives of Quebec. The National Archives of Quebec, under Mr. Berthiaume and under Ms. Bissonnette, have not librairie. They have the same structure, Librairie et Archives Québec. They have not, they have had cuts too, but at the same time, they have been able to manage institution in a way where it continues to play the role that it should play. And what is very sad in the case of the archives is that Canada was a leader in the archivist world, and the National Archives, in fact, were a model, and now it has, when I go to work outside of Canada, it's mostly to France, and, colleagues are constantly asking me questions about the National Archives.
Yeah, and I've spent a lot of time with the archives over the past few years, and it's noticeable, the changes just in sitting there working, and I feel bad for the people who are there because they're trying their best. They're just not put in the position to be as effective as they could be. They're being put in positions to make decisions on things or to try and, if you have a research question, you're being sent to somebody who just doesn't maybe have the background in it, or doesn't have the familiarity with it. So it's not the employees who are there, it's that they're just not being put in the right positions.
I probably know myself about 20 persons who have had major problems accessing the resources of the National Archives in the past, let's say 3 or 4 years. And here I'm the only one. I'm one historian. So you can imagine when you spread that, and it is especially bad for graduate students who are scholars, young scholars who don't have necessarily the funds and who are not in Ottawa. They are in BC. They are in Nova Scotia. And if they cannot have access to interlibrary loan, it is a tragedy. Mm-hmm. For them. And this is interesting because until very recently, I hope it will change, the discourse at the National Archives was, no, that's not true. There is still a rate of satisfaction, but that's what happened when cultural institutions are left in the hands of people who are only bureaucrats.
Well, I guess that sort of begs the question then. I mean, what can be done about this? I mean, if someone's listening and is upset and wants to do something, is there any recourse?
Oh, I think the recourse, I think for the population, the recourse is to lobby, to write to your MP, to write to the minister, to go to the events organized by Save Library and Archives Canada, and I truly hope that in the case of the archive, that the new archivist will be able to steer the ship back in the right direction. I can tell you that I don't think he has started yet. And still there is a different approach. He answers emails. He wants to talk to historians. He's not in his bull there trying to reinvent the way archives and documentation should be managed.
So there is stuff that we can do, and so it's not this sort of helpless feeling that
I don't think so. Of course, it's far more difficult to engage the population on the questions of heritage policies and management of archives than it is to engage them on health issues and education. But there is, I think that it can be done, and it comes a time. I think we see it with the veterans. There comes a time when a government overdoes it, where they start to alienate their own base. And one day, you know, someone who may have voted for the conservatives, who truly believe in the principles of the conservative government, will write to the National Archives and won't get the information that he's trying to get. And then this person will start to think, here is what is happening at the archive. But until you're there, you know, what are the archives doing? It's not clear.
Right.
For most people.
Mm-hmm. So the article, again, is Conscripting Canada's Past, the Harper Government and the Politics of Memory. It's in the most recent edition of the Canadian Journal of History. We are posting this on Tuesday, the 27th. The article is open access. And normally the Canadian Journal of History is not, but this article in particular will be open access. We believe at least until June the 10th, which is the latest email that I've gotten, perhaps longer. But if you're getting this only on iTunes, you can go to ActiveHistory.ca. The post in which this podcast will be featured will have a link to the article, to the open access article. Or if you want, you can always just Google Conscripting Canada's Past and find it there. And so we would encourage everybody to go read the article and check it out. And it's available in both languages as well. And there's the English language version, the French language version. So whichever one you're more comfortable with, they're both available for you. And of course, the author is Yves Frenette from the Université de Saint-Boniface, and we thank you for joining us on the podcast.
C'est moi qui vous remercie.
If you have any questions, comments for the podcast, historyslam@gmail.com, Twitter @Dr. Shawnee Fever, and if you're out and you see Enrico Palazzo, please say hi for me.
Thanks for listening to the History Slam podcast. Be sure to check out Active History for more features, articles, and be sure to subscribe on iTunes.